We'll now turn to tonight's panel discussion. It is my great pleasure to introduce our panelists, Yi Chen, the director of the documentary First Vote, and Chavi Koneru, co-founder and executive director of North Carolina Asian Americans Together, NCAT. Yi Chen is a Washington, D.C. based documentary filmmaker, a Soros Equality Fellow, and DC Arts and Humanities Fellow. Yi's work has been supported by the Ford Foundation Just Films, Open Society Foundations, Center for Asian American Media, ITVS, DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities, Cartman Quinn Film and Southern Documentary Fund. Her debut feature, First Vote, is an official selection at the 2020 AFI Docs, Hot Springs Documentary Film Festival, Hawaii International Film Festival, CanFest, LA Asian Pacific Film Festival, Vancouver Asian Film Festival, and more. The film launches in virtual cinema nationwide, followed by broadcast premiere on World Channel's American Reframed series in October. It's also currently on a campus and community tour across the US through Good Docs and its Good Talks speaker series. Yi holds an MFA in Film and Media Arts from American University and established C35 Films to tell underrepresented stories. Our second panelist, Chavi Koneru, is co-founder and current executive director of NCAT and the affiliated organization NCAT in Action. Chavi leads the NCAT's efforts to remove barriers to civic participation and to increase visible representation for the AAPI community in North Carolina. She attended the University of North Carolina for college and later for law school, so she is double Tar-Heel, where her concentration was in voting rights law. Her prior professional experience includes stints at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, and NARAL in North Carolina. Professor Heidi Kim will moderate the panel discussion and audience Q&A will follow. So please submit your questions on chat anytime during the discussion. I'll now turn the floor over to Professor Heidi Kim, the Director of Asian American Center. Thank you. Heidi?
Thanks, Ji-Yeon, and thanks to our panelists for being here with us. I'll be asking questions and hopefully promoting a conversation between our panelists. Feel free to start dropping questions into the chat at any time. And after about a half hour, I think, we'll start taking those questions. I do want to note before I begin that I also happen to be the chair of the board of North Carolina Asian Americans Together. I feel compelled to disclose that. That's just something I do in my personal time. It has no affiliation with the university. So let's start though with hearing, Chavi, what you are seeing on the ground right now in terms of Asian American interest and intent to vote in this upcoming election.
Sure, thanks, Heidi. So I can tell you anecdotally that we're seeing a lot more interest. We've had different community groups reach out to us, a lot more interest in engaging, particularly in our in-language work. But also if we're looking at statistics for absentee ballot request forms compared to this point in 2016, and these stats are as of Monday, Asian Americans had requested 9 times as many absentee ballots as they had in 2016. And obviously we're still in that request period. And 29% of those folks have already completed, turned in their ballots, and it's 10% of all AAPI voters. So that is definitely higher than in past years. And I think that's evidence of the interest and I think the importance that people feel of this upcoming election.
Is that level of enthusiasm pretty consistent across different ethnic groups? remembering, of course, that Asian America is such a diverse construct?
Yeah, I would say that it's higher in the groups that have the largest populations in North Carolina. So Indian Americans, Chinese Americans, Korean, Vietnamese, and I'm forgetting one, but sorry for whatever I'm forgetting. But the Southeast Asian population, I don't think is as motivated in this election compared to I think it's probably on par with prior years, but we haven't seen that same boost in that population.
Oh, interesting. Any speculation about why that is?
I would say some of it is probably yes, Filipino. Yes, thank you. Some of it is probably the impact of COVID, and the other is that, you know, language access has always been an issue, and even with an organization like ours now present in the state, there's only so much we can do, and there's 40 different languages spoken across North Carolina, and so it's certainly hard to reach some of those smaller populations. And I do think that people coming from countries like India, where English is a required language for children in school, it's easier to engage when you have enough information, and language isn't as big of a barrier.
Thanks. And E, a similar question for you, because obviously you've been virtually going around the country with this documentary. And so I'm really interested in hearing how the film is resonating with Asian American audiences and what the reaction has been.
Yeah, it's been really great. So the film premiered in May. So it's been doing more than 10 festivals. But more importantly, the film has been screening at more than 20 community screenings, such as this one with mostly Asian American organizations. So there's a lot of interest from civic engagement organizations to show the film and to mobilize their voters. Because everything is virtual, so we have an audience survey form that we, that's one way we get feedback from audience. So from that, what we've been hearing is that the film has energized them to stay hopeful and to be civically engaged. And some audience also say that the film has inspired them to ask more questions of those whose beliefs are different from them. I've also heard from people, including people who worked on the film, that the film has started a conversation with their family members who are on the other side of the aisle.
Thanks. What inspired you to make the film originally?
So I started the project after the 2016 election. I'm actually an immigrant. I came here 17 years ago and I became a citizen last year, and I'm a first-time voter myself this year. So having never voted before, I really wanted to learn more about civic engagement, voting, democratic process, specifically from voters in my own community. Particularly after 2016, the election really divided Asian American communities. And as you saw in the film, it affected Kaiser and his family on a very personal level. So I was really, interested in talking to voters, voters in my own community.
And Chavi, on a similar note, what inspired you to found NCAT?
Yeah, so like Yi, it was personal for me. When I moved to North Carolina, the population of South Asians across the entire state was around 10,000. And I grew up not ever feeling like the term North Carolinian applied to me, because I felt so different compared to everyone else. I have to say that the total exception was when I was in my Chapel Hill bubble for those 7 years. But I think it took me moving away to realize that North Carolina was a big part of me and that I did want my voice to be heard here. And so one of the big reasons I moved back was I was engaged in politics in DC and felt like I need to come back to my state where it's important for voices like mine to be heard. I came back and realized, oh my gosh, there's this huge population of us now, and we can actually make a difference. So that was really the incentive for it. But the reason the organization was founded is because of the reception from the community. I guess there was a lot of people out there like me who were just waiting for the information and really wanted to get engaged and have themselves heard and represented in North Carolina.
Yeah, on that note, you know, that kind of hunger for information that you found in the community, why is it so important for NCAT to work on voter education and protection and engagement in North Carolina for Asian Americans?
So as I mentioned before briefly, one of the biggest issues is language access, right? There's so many different languages and there's not just the language, but it's also not being able to understand the information because it's presented in a way that's not culturally competent or not targeted to our population. So a study that we did in 2016 showed that 70% of Asian Americans in the South had never been contacted about an election, not from a candidate, not from a political party, nobody, right? So we're providing this information, we're providing it in a way that makes sense to people who don't understand the civic engagement or the democratic process, and we're trying to provide it in language and ideally from trusted community leaders. And then in addition to that, you know, the voter suppression efforts that impact all communities of color, such as voter ID laws or vote by mail this year has been a huge issue because of all the changing rules. And so you need someone that's going to reach out to your community and explain what's going on so that you can get your vote counted.
Yeah, and of course, those are obstacles that cut across partisan lines for Asian Americans. E, in your film, of course, it's quite clear that you chose these 4 fascinating subjects who also span the political spectrum. But I'm wondering if there were common concerns for either the subjects in your film or the Asian Americans you're talking to around the country that you're finding are crossing partisan lines.
Yeah, so when I was filming during the 2018 midterms, so one of the issues that that came across a lot was the redistricting in Ohio. So that was on the ballot in 2018. And in North Carolina, it was the voter ID amendment that was on the ballot. So in terms of the voter ID amendment, the 3 characters that live in North Carolina, Sue, she's a Republican, and Lance and Jennifer are Democrats. So they actually have very different views on voter ID amendment. However, in Ohio, the character Lance, he's Republican, but he actually supports the redistricting. He actually doesn't want Ohio to be gerrymandered. So, you know, so that was actually interesting. Yeah, so those are, you know, those are the kind of the 2 main issues that came across when I was filming the project in 2018.
Of course, redistricting is a big issue in North Carolina. I'm curious, is NCAT finding that redistricting is on the minds of North Carolina Asian American voters?
Not this year.
Not this year.
With you that in 2018, that voter ID amendment was really important. It was on everyone's mind, and the API community, even in North Carolina, was really split on it. This year, however, and we actually did the first ever survey of Asian American voters across the state. Results will be released next week, so we're excited about that. But just to sort of give you a preview, the 3 issues that came up the most were around the pandemic, so healthcare issues because of it, discrimination against people of color, and this was both like from a racial justice perspective and the discrimination that APIs in particular are facing due to language used around COVID, and then foreign policy. And I think that's not surprising, and I think it's important to note that people feel a very strong connection to their home countries, and it's important to like talk about that. This is for elected officials and candidates to also connect with that part of people, because it's a big part of their API identity as well.
It's really interesting to hear about those specific issues, because when you look at big national surveys of Asian American voters, right, they're always surveying about really broad topics. And so unsurprisingly, right, the number 1 concern is often economic concerns, and number 2 might be something like education or safety. And so these really specific immediate concerns, maybe heightened by the pandemic, I think really they give me a whole new insight, I think, into thinking about engaging Asian American voters and speaking to Asian American voters.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's true. And that's another reason that it's important to focus on North Carolina Asian American voters separate from nationally, because we have different demographics here. We have Asian Americans who came over a lot more recently. It's just that caring about voting with your wallet, right? That's what people say about Asian Americans. It just doesn't seem to be true in this state based on everything we've done in the last 4 years.
Well, you made a reference there to, of course, the differences in political views based on sort of, shall we say, immigration generation. So I'm sure most on this webinar might know, but in the Asian American community and other heavily immigrant communities, right, often people speak of themselves by what generation of American they are, right? Are you a first generation American, meaning just immigrated? Are you second generation, meaning parents immigrated, et cetera? So E, I'm curious, because again, you had a cross section, you really had lovely cross sections in the documentary. And I'm wondering about how you saw maybe differences in political opinion or engagement falling along the lines of immigration generation.
Yeah, so as you saw in the film, the 2 Republican characters, they grew up in China and they came here as adults, and Jennifer and Kaiser, they are American-born Asian American. So their parents or grandparents' generation moved to Taiwan, and through Taiwan during the Civil War, because they were part of the National Party versus the Communist Party. So they basically fled to Taiwan, and via Taiwan they came to the United States. So Jennifer and Kaiser, they were born and grew up here. So I don't want to generalize these 2 groups, because there are first generation immigrants from China that are Democrats, and there are Asian Americans that are Republicans. But just based on my experience filming and getting to know the characters in my film, I would say that Lance and Sue's experience growing up in China actually has a big impact on how they vote here. And as you saw in the film, when it comes to political rhetoric like socialism and communism, it triggers them or resonates with them in a very different way because of where they grew up. And for Jennifer and Kaiser, their family went through, for example, the 1965 Immigration Act. Before that, there was a racial quota, but because of that law, immigrants from Asian can immigrate here, and Asian Americans didn't have voting rights till 1952, and they understand history of Asian Americans in the United States. So the background, they have very different backgrounds, and that different experience growing up in different countries, contribute to how they form their political views.
Thanks. And similarly to you, Chavi, how do you see people navigating, especially I think in NCAT's work with youth and with student leaders, how do you see people trying to navigate those conversations and that divide in their own families? Because I know that's a subject that comes up a lot for our student population, right? How do you talk with your parents or your extended family members about politics or issues of racial strife? Do you see that anxiety coming up in the groups that you work with?
Yeah, it certainly comes up. I mean, I think it's been an issue for everybody since 2016. But kind of going back to what he said, I don't think you can generalize across these different ethnic groups. And so part of it is the sense that youth that are born in America who particularly are that Gen Z, is that what we call it, below 25? Are the Gen Z or college age are more progressive and potentially more radical. But I can tell you from experience that we've had youth in our program who have been extreme Trump supporters and whose parents were essentially born and raised in America. And so yes, people grapple with it, but it's at different levels. And we certainly have youth who, come to us to want to talk through, how do I bring this conversation up with, say, my grandparents, right, or my parents. I think it's more for our age group that it's our parents. I lost my train of thought. Hang on, I was going to say something. I think from what I've seen, and obviously what I can speak to the most is the Indian American community, since that's what I belong to, is it seems to be more based on economic level than it does age. And so people who are extremely affluent tend to lean right more. But I do think that's a change I've seen coming up to this election. Is maybe it's the pandemic, maybe it's the administration, but it seems like that's starting to shift a little bit.
Interesting. And E, you offered us a different kind of insight into North Carolina voters because you featured quite a few of them. I was proud to see North Carolina so well represented in this film. And I wanted to ask you specifically, you had UNC alum Sue Gouge, who was a Republican candidate for State House in 2018. And of course, our very own former UNC professor, Jennifer Ho. And like a talk show host, I'm going to say she's here tonight. I see her name on our webinar list. And I want to ask you, I probably shouldn't have told you that Jennifer was on before I asked you this question, but what led you to feature these two women? What did they represent to you as a storyteller? What did they bring to that story that you wanted to tell about Asian American voters?
Yeah, so when I started the project, so obviously it's a documentary, so it really evolves along the way. So when I first started the project, I was looking for first-time voters, and I was looking for voters in specifically battleground states. So, Sue came to my attention because she, like you said, she ran for Congress in 2016. And regardless of her political affiliation, the fact that first generation immigrant woman run for office in a battleground state like North Carolina, I think it's, it's not the stereotypical, stories that we hear. So, so that's really interesting to me. And I initially actually a few months of production was with Kaiser, Jennifer, and Lance. And I actually met Jennifer at an event where she actually gave a talk on Asian American identity in the South. So at the time I was filming with Kaiser and Sue in North Carolina for a few months, and I've been thinking about this theme of identity. So her talk immediately resonated with me. So I approached her and asked her if I could film her classes at UNC. So yeah, and the more I film with her, the more I realize that this theme or this question of Asian American identity actually really ties into how people vote. Like I started to see that connection there. And also for myself, I was also curious about this new identity for me as an immigrant, but becoming an American, an Asian American, and what does that mean? So in a lot of ways, spending time with Jennifer and going to her classes also helped me answer a lot of the questions that I had for myself.
I think in her years at UNC, Jennifer helped a lot of people think through those questions around Asian American identity and other issues. And we're so grateful for all of her educational work here. Chavi, my last question for the panel before we open it up to Q&A. I feel like even though NCAT is, an engagement 501c3, education also is very important to you. You do a lot of educational workshops. You've had storytelling workshops, youth leadership institutes. And so I'm wondering how, what Yi just said sort of meshes with the kind of educational work you do, and how you see that kind of Asian American identity exploration and formation meshing with voter engagement.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that it impacts how people vote, and especially in North Carolina, which has always been very black and white in the conversation, the engagement, all of it has really focused on these two populations. So with the Asian American population growing, I think part of encouraging engagement is to talk about where we fit in, what our history is, how our history fits into the history of other folks in North Carolina. And I guess I have to give a shout out to Jennifer too, since she helped us plan our first Asian American Identity workshop. And you, Heidi. And so, yeah, that's a big part of it. And particularly for every one of us who's involved in the organization grew up here in North Carolina. And so we've had this experience of not having a forum to talk about the other, right? And so creating that for our youth has been really, really important to us. And I think also with the pandemic and the uprising, there's been this shift to talking about racial justice. But for us, we've been talking about it the whole time, right? Because that's a big part of voting and engagement and having your voice heard in North Carolina. So I absolutely agree.
Well, thank you both for a wonderful conversation, but it's not over yet. I'm going to turn it over to Ji-Yeon to bring in audience questions. And we've had quite a few coming in already on the chat.
Yes, indeed. Well, thanks Heidi, Yi, and Chavi for your engaging conversation. And you have touched up on many important issues, but I also have received quite a few very interesting questions. So I will relay our audience questions to you. And for our audience, if you haven't posted your question, please feel free to do it right now. Okay, so this is question to E. From KL. So your film is so interesting and very insightful. Have you had any follow-up with individuals featured in the film and who are GOP/Trump supporters during the pandemic? What are their thoughts about the anti-Chinese sentiment in the rhetoric coming out of White House?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I wish I could answer, but unfortunately, I really haven't had time to ask these specific questions with Lance and Sue. So I don't know, but actually Jennifer, who's at University of Colorado Boulder now, and so her center is actually hosting a panel discussion on October 22nd with all 4 of the characters. So if you're interested, go to our website. The information is on firstvotefilm.com. And yeah, and I suspect that this question might come up.
Okay, Yi, did you say it's October 22nd?
Yes.
Okay, so for audience, we will send you, follow-up email. So we'll include that information in our follow-up email. Thank you. So I think next question is from Austin to Chavi. And I apologize if NCAT gets this question too much, but does being a nonpartisan nonprofit limit some of the goals that the organization wants to accomplish?
Yeah, that's a fair question. Yes, it does. And because of that, this year we formed an affiliated 501c4 political advocacy organization that does allow us to go a step further as far as engaging candidates. So well, that got us around the issue.
Okay, great. And the next question is from Susin So. And this is a question for Yi. She's curious about if the podcaster in Ohio, I think she meant Lance Chen, and the Tea Party candidate Sue Goose are still supporting the GOP in 2020. So yeah, you mentioned that you haven't followed up with them. So do you have any idea?
I don't know because and I don't want to speak for them, and I haven't really specifically asked them this question.
Yeah. As far as I could find, I don't think Sue is running for any seats, right? This 2020. So, but I do not know either for any other info. We don't have any other information. Okay. So this is a question from Jasmine to Chavi. Chavi, she's really curious to know the reasons behind the youth's strong support of Trump that you've encountered. So can you give us some examples?
Yeah. I can, unfortunately. It was surprising a lot of it was based around immigration and not surprisingly around affirmative action. So there's a sense that it's part of the Republican rhetoric on we work hard and we do well, and our parents are affluent and we're going to good schools, and we didn't get any assistance getting here, right? And so one of the things, and this is, I mean, I'm sure all of you have heard this from APIs in the community, affirmative action is a very divisive issue, but particularly around, well, why should someone else get in when I've spent forever working on my SATs or whatever? And I feel like that's where some of this was initially coming from, but it definitely was full on against what they referred to as illegal immigrants, and thought that it was fine for kids to be separated from their families and to be caged, as they said, because they weren't following the rules. And this is not the only time I've heard such extreme views. It was definitely shocking to hear it from someone at that age. But ultimately, when you're younger, a lot of what you think and what you say comes from the way your parents feel, right?
Yes. Yeah. So, and also that reminds us about the class background and socioeconomic, the background of the immigrants, right? We are not like, I haven't heard any opposition of immigrants with a wealthy background. Actually, we welcome them, right? With all different, all different, measures in immigration law, but a lot of implications that we saw from the film and also in our everyday conversations with people are very embedded with the class bias and class background of the immigrants. Yes.
I just wanted to pop in to say on the topic of affirmative action, for anyone on the webinar who hasn't seen it, the September 30th event that the CAC and AAC co-hosted by Professor Aiko Day was a really thoughtful look at some of the specific attacks on affirmative action or race-conscious admissions using Asian American plaintiffs, or using this rhetoric around Asian American plaintiffs. And that video is still available to UNC affiliates. It's on an Onion protected webpage. So I'll drop that in the chat for everyone.
You're welcome. I was just trying to promote your friend. I did want to just really quickly raise up what James said in the chat, as far as many preteen and teenage are taking views opposing to their parents. I mean, I think that's an important point as well. Like, my dad is super liberal, so I'm kind of a little bit more this way, but I've definitely seen it with a lot of people. Yeah.
Okay, great. So, well, if we don't have any further questions, this will be our last question from Jasmine Cho again to Yi. What were some of your processes or strategies in finding the first-time voters for your film, in addition to some of the organic questions you made, like with Jennifer Hall? Can you? Okay. Yes. So that. Sorry.
Yeah.
So
hi, Jasmine. Yeah, it was a really long process. I started the project early 2017, and it took me about 5 or 6 months actually to find the characters. So my first filming with Sue was actually in May. So I actually didn't know any members of the Chinese Americans for Trump movement. So I just started asking around people I know if they know somebody. So I was eventually connected with somebody, and then I talked to him and asked him if he would be in a documentary, and he didn't want to be in a documentary, so he said, oh, why don't you talk to someone else? So just that process went on for a few months, and I talked to a lot of people, which was actually good because that was part of the research for the film. So Lens came up because actually several people in Virginia told me that they listened to his podcast on a Chinese social media app, WeChat. So they told me about him. So that's actually how I found out about him. And I reached out to him because he teaches at University of Dayton. So it's easy to find him. And so I told him about the project, and I asked if I could film him recording his podcast. So he said yes right away. So it really goes both ways. What I'm looking for, and also on the other side, like the access I can get from the characters, because this is an observational style film. It actually, I spent almost 2 years with the characters, so it's a lot of time. It's a very involved process. Yeah, so that's how it happened.
Great. So speaking of WeChat, I saw in the beginning of your film that the Asian Americans for the Trump organization mobilized through WeChat. And considering the current controversy with the WeChat and TikTok ban, that Carolina Asia Center will also have another panel discussion on October 17th is kind of interesting. In this time, 2020, with COVID and Asian Americans and WeChat and TikTok ban, that a lot of Chinese, like almost all Chinese Americans and Chinese in China are using to not only communicate, to many other things are on the verge of, banned by the US government. So that's a important, I think, very, very interesting, how they were once mobilized to support Trump, right? Okay, let me, I think we just got another question. So this is from Austin, and he posed a question for both of you. How do you keep the motivation to do such important work when sometimes, especially outside of election seasons, it seems like work on Asian American don't matter? Do you have moments of doubt? If so, could you speak to how you keep going?
You go first.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It was actually so great to hear Representative Chu talk about Asian American voters this year. I actually, just through the film, the research, I didn't know that, there are 11 million eligible Asian American voters this year. And like Representative Chu said, that if we all vote, we can really make a difference. So with this film, I have been doing community screenings, and it's part of our impact campaign, really, to help support organizations like Chavi's organizations, the great work they're doing on the ground to mobilize Asian American voters and increase turnout this year. So yeah, I mean, I'm actually, really excited that I will be voting for the first time this year, and I've seen a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of great work that AAPI civic engagement organizations are doing, such as Chavi in North Carolina. So hopefully we'll have a higher turnout this year.
We're excited that you can vote
Yes.
too. So I guess my answer is yes, definitely have moments of doubt, especially because I left a legal career behind. But I think, especially for an organization like NCAT, we're the only social justice Pan-Asian organization in the state of North Carolina that's trying to increase voter engagement in our community. And now we have the only political advocacy organization. So at times it's feeling like, well, if we're not going to do it, who is? And I'd say particularly this year, there's been lots of times where wondered, what's the point if the whole government's falling apart? But also I have two young kids. And so that's really my main motivation, is that we're leaving behind all of this for them. And so it definitely helps keep me going. Thank you for asking the question. Oh, and I'm sorry. I just have to do a really quick shout out for our early vote event tomorrow. Early voting in North Carolina starts tomorrow, and we will be in Cary at the Herbert C. Young Community Center, and Ben & Jerry's will be there giving out free ice cream. So please join us. If you have questions, go to ncat.vote. Thank you.
Can I just
Yes.
add?
Yes, please.
Yes. So making a documentary is not easy, but for me, it's really important to tell Asian American stories and experiences that we don't see often on screen. So if you watch a film, I hope you'll tell your family and friends about it. And if you haven't seen it, I think you still have till the 16th to watch it. And after that, so the film is also in virtual cinema in North Carolina. So it's at the Carolina Theater. If you go to their website, it's a virtual cinema. Anyone in the United States can watch it. And also our broadcast premiere is on October 20th. So go to America Reframed website. So the information is on the website.
Thanks, Yi. So also, how long will the virtual cinema last at the Carolina Theater? Do you know?
Yeah, I believe it would run till October. It's a 2-week run. So the 22nd.
Oh, okay. So still all the people who joined us today can watch until 16th, and then after that from the virtual cinema. And I'm happy to inform our audiences that the UNC Library purchased the perpetual rights of the first vote. So by the end of this semester, we'll have a permanently host the first vote in our Media Resource Center. So you can always watch them and go back to, watch them again at the end of the semester. Thank you so much for your wonderful, conversation. And I thank Heidi for moderating the talk, and our audience for sending us such an engaging and interesting and thought-provoking question.